how do you translate the word Buddha? What do we mean when we talk about the Buddha's actual achievement? How do we translate that achievement into English terms? This may seem like a minor point, but in a certain way it sort of strikes at the heart of how we understand the goal of the Buddhist path. If you're new to this channel, by the way, and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to this channel and click that bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So how do we understand the word Buddha? How do we translate it? This may seem like a minor point, but I don't think it really is. There's been a recent paper out by Bhikkhu Bodhi, who is a very eminent translator of the early texts and scholar. He's a monastic. I have a number of his translations behind me on the bookshelf of the early Buddhist texts. Basically, he weighs in on this pretty much a long-standing kind of discussion about this term, Buddha. Now, basically, there have been two ways to translate it into English, either as awakening or as enlightenment. That is to say, the Buddha's final achievement of what is called Bodhi, the Pāli term is Bodhi or Sambodhi. By the way, there's a kind of an irony here that it's Bhikkhu Bodhi, a person whose given name, his monastic name is Bodhi, is actually weighing in on this point, but nevertheless, it's the word Bodhi that we're trying to translate, or the word Buddha, which is a related term. And we might wonder whether there was a controversy over this, but in fact there sort of has been. Back when people first began translating this term into English, the two alternate translations were used sort of interchangeably. Either he was called, for instance, the Buddha was either termed the awakened one or the enlightened one. And his achievement was either termed awakening or enlightenment, and these two were sort of used interchangeably. However, in the last few decades, there have been a number of scholars who have made arguments, in particular, that awakening is the proper way to translate this term, Bodhi. And so the Buddha should be known as the awakened one. In particular, this comes out of an argument by the very eminent Pāli scholar K.R. Norman, who argued quite a while back that basically we should term this awakening and the Buddha as the awakened one because the root of these terms, the root is a word Buddh in Pāli and in related Sanskritic languages anyway, that this term means awaken, means to wake up, literally. And since the term has to do with awakening, that is to say waking up, and not with light in any sense, so it doesn't have to do with the light of enlightenment, therefore it's pretty clear for K.R. Norman that the proper translation of this was awakening. However, in his recent paper, Bhikkhu Bodhi argues that this is not correct. He argues that in fact enlightenment is the proper way to interpret, to translate this term. Bhikkhu Bodhi bases his argument on three pillars. The first pillar has to do with the English dictionary definitions of the two terms in question, waking up or awakening and enlightenment. The second pillar has to do with how the term Buddh is used, or these terms are used within the Pāli language. In other words, looking at Pāli now. And the third pillar, and I think the strongest pillar, has to do with Bhikkhu Bodhi looking at the associated metaphors and similes and examples used in the early texts having to do with the Buddha's, let's say, experience of nirvana, his final experience before becoming a Buddha. And so what we'll do in this talk, what I'm going to do is to go through these three basic points that Bhikkhu Bodhi makes in his paper. Obviously, we're not going to be able to go into them in any real depth. If you're interested in reading the paper, I'll leave a link to it down below in the notes. Bhikkhu Bodhi's also got a Q&A in a recent issue of Tricycle magazine, and I'll leave a link to that Q&A as well down in the notes in case you want to read that. And after I look at these three parts of Bhikkhu Bodhi's argument, I want to spend a little bit of time looking at a kind of hidden irony or contradiction within this usage of the term that Bhikkhu Bodhi suggests. So in any event, looking at the first pillar of Bhikkhu Bodhi's argument, he looks at the English, the dictionary definitions of these terms in English, where enlightenment has to do with coming into knowledge or understanding of something, whereas waking up has to do with coming into awareness after a period of sleep. So, in other words, what we're looking at is, what do these terms mean in English? What connotations do they have in an English context? And Bhikkhu Bodhi, using these dictionary definitions, argues that the Buddha's achievement of, let's just say, nirvana, to use a neutral term here, his achievement of nirvana is more associated with the dictionary definition of enlightenment. That is to say, the Buddha coming into knowledge or understanding. In particular, Bhikkhu Bodhi says, when the Buddha achieves nirvana, he comes into a knowledge or understanding of the Four Noble Truths. This is how the Buddha's nirvana, his final experience, as it were, is described in the early texts as seeing and knowing the Four Noble Truths in a very direct way. Bhikkhu Bodhi goes on to argue that the idea of waking up, he says, has more in common with the idea of something more like stream entry in early Buddhism. Now, stream entry, I've done an earlier video on stream entry and the related kind of states. I'll leave a link to that down below in the notes. But basically, stream entry is sort of our first breakthrough to understanding or vision of the Dharma itself from a period of being a normal person who has no real understanding of Buddhism. So it's the first vision that is supposed to clear up our doubts. And so it's described in the text as a kind of a breakthrough in that sense. And Bhikkhu Bodhi argues that that kind of breakthrough from a period of delusion fits more with awakening, at least in the dictionary definition, than awakening does with the Buddha's final experience of nirvana. Now, the second point that Bhikkhu Bodhi makes in this article has to do directly with K.R. Norman's argument that essentially we should be calling the Buddha the awakened one because Bud, this root of the term Buddha, means to wake up. Bhikkhu Bodhi argues that in fact that's not really the case. He argues that waking up is only basically a secondary definition, a secondary meaning of this root Bud and associated terms like Bodhi. He argues by looking at contemporary dictionaries and at usage that in fact the word Bodhi in early Buddhism in Pāli really does mean something more like realizing or becoming aware of or understanding. And that waking up is only a secondary definition, and indeed that he says that the word is almost never used in the context of waking up from sleep. At least in the word Bodhi itself, he says that there are other terms with different prefixes that mean waking up from sleep, but the word Bodhi really almost never does. Now, Bhikkhu Bodhi's third argument, which I think is his most convincing and strongest argument, is that if you look at the early texts and the way the Buddha's nirvana is described, it's often described in terms of shedding light in the darkness. This idea that there is darkness and then light arises that is really a central metaphor that's used time and again when describing this realization. You find many metaphors where essentially knowledge is analogized to light, in much the same way that it's analogized to light within the context of the European Enlightenment, for example, this period in, let's say, the 18th century in Europe, with the arising of the scientific awareness of the world. I should say as well that Bhikkhu Bodhi talks a little bit about this analogy between the enlightenment of the Buddha and the enlightenment that happened in Europe as a sort of a historical event. And many people reject use of the term enlightenment when it comes to the Buddha because it could be confused with the European Enlightenment. And Bhikkhu Bodhi's argument here is basically that that's not really a problem, because we can pretty easily understand that these are completely different contexts. And so once that difference has been called to mind, it's not difficult for us to separate these two, the enlightenment within a Buddhist context and the enlightenment within a context of European history, let's say. Nevertheless, I think that there are similarities here, and Bhikkhu Bodhi, in fact, mentions, or at least comments on some of the similarities in the Q&A in Tricycle magazine. So in any event, getting back to the point here, having to do with the analogy of light and knowledge in early Buddhism, one example would be that at the Buddha's attainment of nirvana, he says, "This was the third clear knowledge attained by me in the last watch of the night. Ignorance was banished, and clear knowledge arose. Darkness was banished, and light arose." Indeed, it's usually said that the Buddha's enlightenment, the Buddha's nirvana, happened at the break of dawn, or around that time. So the analogy is made explicit in the time of day when this is said to have occurred. That is, the light of the sun is supposed to basically analogize that sort of dawning awareness or dawning knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, among other things. Now, also, the same kind of metaphor is used when the Buddha makes other people aware of the truth of the Dharma. There's a stock passage that's used when somebody has heard the Buddha speak about the Dharma and suddenly begins to understand what the Buddha is talking about. And here, the stock passage goes something like this. "Master Gotama has made the Dhamma clear in many ways, as though he were turning upright what had been overthrown, revealing what was hidden, showing the way to one who was lost, or holding up a lamp in the darkness so those with good eyesight can see forms." So holding up a lamp in the darkness here is a pretty clear analogy of light to this dawning awareness. It's kind of interesting that a recent, well, not so recent book by the late scientist Carl Sagan, when talking about science, and in a book called The Demon-Haunted World, he analogizes the rise of science to holding a lamp in the darkness, to holding a candle in the dark. Now, of course, Carl Sagan was talking out of a period of the European Enlightenment. In other words, his analogy comes out of the Enlightenment of Europe rather than the Buddhist Enlightenment. But again, very, very similar kinds of imagery used in both situations. Now, clearly in this example of the Buddha, or I should say of somebody listening to the Buddha, it's not an example of the person who listens to the Buddha becoming enlightened or becoming having an experience of nirvana. They don't. However, it is an example where the Buddha is analogized as somebody who sheds light on things, rather than somebody who wakes up people from sleep. As Bhikkhu Bodhi says, the Buddha is never analogized in the suttas or sutras as somebody who wakes somebody from sleep. Instead, he's analogized as somebody in the early suttas as somebody who sheds light. And as you might imagine, there are many more examples like these in Bhikkhu Bodhi's paper, which you can read if you want to hear more. Now, in order to describe this experience of the Buddha, I've tried to use neutral terms instead of describing it as enlightenment or as awakening, because those are precisely which term we're using is right what we're trying to argue about or trying to discuss. So I've used the term nirvana, or nibbana is the Pāli term, but that raises a kind of an ironic point here, or even a kind of a subtle contradiction. Because as we say, we use the term enlightenment here, at least Bhikkhu Bodhi suggests we use the term enlightenment, because the Buddha is analogized as somebody who holds up a lamp in the darkness. On the other hand, the term nibbana, or nirvana, is a term that literally means blown out or extinguished. That is to say, somebody who has reached that stage is somebody who has blown out or extinguished, in particular, the three fires of greed, hatred, and delusion or ignorance. Now, these three fires are analogized to the fires of the Vedic Brahman, the three sacrificial fires that the Vedic Brahman is supposed to keep lit. That's part of the Vedic Brahman's Dharma, is to keep lit these three fires. And the Buddha basically is constructing his idea of a Dharma as a kind of a response to that by saying that we have to put out these three fires, in particular, again, the three fires of greed, hatred, and ignorance. So the irony here is that the Buddha is basically saying that darkness was dispelled and light arose when he blew out these three fires. Or that he is holding up a lamp in the darkness by blowing the candle's light out. It is kind of a strange, ironic, or contradictory group of metaphors here. It's almost, we might say, almost like a Zen koan. And indeed, when we look to something like Zen as a counterfoil here, or as something that is almost at the heart of the kinds of metaphors being used, we see also a distinction in the way that enlightenment is perceived, as something that is gradual in the early texts, or as something that is immediate in some Zen experiences. And I did an earlier video about that distinction between whether, I should say, asking whether enlightenment is a gradual process or something that is sudden. In that video, however, I used the term awakening because I had come out of this K.R. Norman idea that awakening was the proper translation, and maybe now, if I were to remake that video, I might do so using the term enlightenment. In any event, if you're interested in this separate or interesting kind of deeper topic here about whether awakening or enlightenment, let's say, is gradual or sudden, take a look at that video. I'll leave a link here up on the screen. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look over at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and see if you want to help out the channel. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next one. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.